Hello, comrades. Good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this special event in our education series. This is on Julian Assange and the looming extradition. Last week, the British government signed off on Julian Assange's extradition to the US, where he could face a sentence of up to 175 years. Yes, but he's been accused of violating the American Espionage Act for publishing classified documents revealing war crimes and torture camps in Iraq and Afghanistan. This was signed off in the same week that Tony Blair was introduced to the Order of the Garter for his services to the establishment and international capitalism, and for war crimes, one might add. And let's remember that Julian is being punished for merely publishing the horrific war crimes that Tony Blair and his mates in high places around the globe have been up to. So it's quite, quite an irony to have that in the same week. So clearly this is supposed to be a deterrent and stop other people speaking out, etc. But it also says a lot about the fragility of the capitalist system, perhaps. So we want to look at a few issues tonight, and we're very glad to be joined by Deepa Driver, the legal observer in the case from the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and Kevin Bean from the Labour Left Alliance. So we want to look at the reasons for the extradition, what it says about the state of imperialism, and what socialists can do now. So we're going to start with Kevin Bean, who's a semi-retired politics lecturer at the University of Liverpool. I'm saying semi-retired because he keeps going back. He can't stop himself. Kevin, can you give us a little bit of context in terms of what imperialism is doing at the moment? It's been quite worrying, I think, for example, to see Britain's new top army general, Patrick Sanders, putting forces on, standby and saying they should be prepared for a long land war against Russia and perhaps even World War III. So Kevin's going to start with that, and then we're going to hear from Deepa.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I'll do a very short introduction. I think comrades would really like to hear from Deepa much more. She's been intimately involved in the case and has got plenty of details and information. And I think it's very important that we understand some of the details of the case. But what I'd like to begin is really to talk about the context. Obviously, the Assange case has rumbled on, has been in and out of the courts, in and out of the newspapers for a number of years. And it's one of those cases that has sort of never been far from the headlines, but has always been, I think, very important for socialists. And indeed, I would suggest anybody that believes generally in civil liberties, and in particular the right to free speech and to publication. It has very serious implications for the ability of journalists and others to write and to investigate. But I think in the current period, essentially in the last year or two, this case has acquired a much deeper significance. And as Tina said in the introduction, this, I think, is linked to a changing pattern of world politics. And for those of us of an older generation who in many ways were formed during the Cold War, this represents, I think, really quite a very different period. It represents, I think, something of a return to the great power rivalries that were very prevalent in the late 19th century, and of course were going to culminate in the First World War. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that with any sort of scaremongering or exaggeration. And indeed, Tina has referred to Sir Patrick Sanders' reference to the need for people in Britain to get used to fighting in Europe. Britain's been involved in enough wars from the 1980s onwards. It's not exactly as if the army has just spent its time doing assault courses and all those wonderful outdoor games that they play in bases in Wales, Scotland, and England. It's actually been an active participant in imperialist operations in Africa, in Asia, and of course in the Falklands. So we are, though, I think, looking at something much more serious and indeed something that is linked to a shift in geopolitics, particularly the growing rivalry between the United States and its allies, I should really say its client states in NATO, and initially Russia. But of course, lurking behind that is the major great power rivalry, which American presidents, American strategists, generals, and so forth identify as China. So that gives us something of the character of the period. Now, many people may think that events in the Pacific, even if they involve a few British ships, don't really impinge on what's happening here at home. That indeed our experience since the 1980s is often these wars which take place in faraway countries appear not essentially to affect us, except when people come home in coffins, and indeed when sections of the population decide that they want to resist and protest, or in some cases turn to violent opposition, and particularly the growth of forms of Islamism and so on in Western Europe. But why I want to emphasize why the Assange case fits into this, and why I think it is so significant, is in this era of great power rivalry, much of the battle that will go on will not just be wars fought in Asia, not just wars fought in Eastern Europe, not just proxy wars such as the one that we're seeing currently in the Ukraine. There'll also be a war at home. And that war at home will involve mobilizing populations, trying to get populations on side. And indeed, as far as the ruling class is concerned, our slogan, "The real enemy is at home," is also one that they have, because they realize that if they're going to enter into this period of serious political conflict, economic conflict, and possibly some military operations, then they need to prepare the population. The politics of that, of building up war fever, of political mobilization, and above all, making a preparation of identifying who the enemy is. One of the things, again, that comrades will be aware of, and again, what is so reminiscent of previous great power rivalries, is the way that we're now, in a sense, almost socialized, we're almost persuaded, we're almost trained into accepting that Russia is the enemy and that China is the enemy, and that the war, in a sense, is now becoming inevitable. The statement by Sir Patrick Sanders, but similar statements from Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, Ben Wallace, and so on, have all sort of encouraged that feeling that we are moving in that direction. And again, historically, we know that when ruling classes are preparing us in this way, that it will not end well. So the importance of the Assange case is that socialists have always stood against the machinations of imperialism. They've always stood in favor of revealing those machinations. And indeed, there's a long tradition going back to Karl Marx in the 19th century, the German socialist, of trying, and of course Lenin, of trying to reveal and trying to expose the machinations of governments, not just the machinations of and cover-ups that are the everyday part of government. We know there are numerous examples of that, from fairly pathetic and trivial matters about about parties in Downing Street, but through to much larger abuses of power, such as Hillsborough. And of course, on a global stage, the sort of work that whistleblowers and journalists like Julian Assange have done shows exactly the nature of those wars. The potential that we have in terms of technology and in terms of exposing what imperialism is up to, is now immense. We only, I think, have to remember the type of recordings and the type of documentation that were revealed and the way that they exposed war crimes. They exposed not only the sort of planning and the arguments behind it, but the torture and indeed the widespread abuses that these imperialist wars contain. So this in some ways is a test case. It's an important test case. It always was an important test case. It was something that even if, for example, we'd not entered into this period, it would have been important to resist. But I think is even more so now that we're in this heightened period in which governments, I think, are stepping up the type of repression and restriction on freedom of expression, and above all, identifying oppositional forces, even most mildest criticisms, as the enemy. And of course, it does very much link into our domestic politics. Laws will be passed, I'm sure, that will tighten up on the Official Secrets Act. There's already been discussions on that. But also the way that oppositional forces in the trade unions and in the working class movement will also be identified as enemies. We've seen something of that with the RMT strike, in which an attempt is made to identify some of the leaders of that union with Putin and with the war in Ukraine. But I think I think this is the context, and I think it's absolutely essential that we defend rights to free speech, that we defend the right to expose what governments do, that we can reveal state secrets. The arguments about the need for state secrecy really play into the hands of the ruling class. We want to throw open those machinations. We want to expose what they're doing. The only people that can benefit from secrecy, the only people that can benefit from those cover-ups are the generals, are the ruling class, are the politicians. We need to shine the light on that. If our movement is fully informed, if the population are fully informed by people like Julian Assange, then they can see the reality of what those wars and what those interventions mean. So the urgency of this case now, I think, has always been there, but it is now doubly important because of these events. And I think, I'm sure that in the discussion this evening, comrades will attempt to draw that. But I think it's also important that we understand that that Julian Assange is a representative figure, that throughout the world there are journalists and opposition figures like him. And if we can win on this case, and if we can show the importance of this case, then that will give heart to socialists and Democrats and other figures who are attempting to shine the light on what governments have been up to. Comrades, that's my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, comrade. Lots of food for thought there, I think, especially a new period. We're entering definitely a new period. The question is, can the working class get its act together to make use of what is happening? There's clearly things are shifting, etc. So, Kevin, I'm suggesting that we bring in Deepa first for 10-15 minutes, and then we open up questions for both of you, if that's okay. I know you have to go at about 7 o'clock. Is that right?
I have to go at about 16:45, so I think it probably is best to if we just focus on Deepa, because she's.
Oops, you muted yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, I just said I think we should focus on Deepa. I'm sorry, I do have to go.
Can I ask you one question then, if you have to rush off? While you were talking, I think the question of the state of imperialism is interesting. I mean, it's changing, but do you think it is changing because it is getting weaker? Is it sort of the inbuilt, crises of capitalism that we're seeing, or why are we entering into this new war? It's not like the working class is posing a particular big threat at the moment. What is changing?
Well, I see one of the fundamental conflicts is that between China and the United States, and obviously the United States, although it's still the dominant world power, is in historical terms in a position of some decline. There's quite a lot of debate about whether that decline will lead to China overtaking the United States. Many of the American strategists think that will happen. A lot of people are rereading their Thucydides and looking at the Peloponnesian War and so on. It's now become a bit of a cliche to talking that way. My own feeling is that China is unlikely to completely overtake the United States, but I think that the argument, certainly in the United States itself, is that the United States can't, in a sense, stand idly by and allow China to expand. And that isn't just economic rivalry. I mean, what is interesting is, particularly in the South China Seas and indeed in other parts of the Pacific, indeed in other areas of Asia where there's a strategic clash, even into Africa as well. The two sides, and I include America's allies in this, which does include Britain, have been sort of lining up in that way. So I think that's very much a great power rivalry, and that has the form of state rivalry, but it also has economic rivalry. And of course, the tendencies towards general crisis in capitalism, we understand those. We understand the way that those economic tensions, the struggle for markets and for dominance and so on, will reoccur. You're right about the working class. I mean, the fact that it is absolutely missing at the moment in comparison, particularly with 1914, is of course the lack of a strong and organized working class movement throughout the world. And we know that the ruling classes in 1914 in many countries, Germany, but even in Britain as well, were afraid of an internal civil war, afraid of a challenge of the working class, and saw the war as a way of drowning that in blood. I don't think that's the situation now. I think we are still at the stage of great power rivalry, but I'm also aware that in comparison, say, with what we might think of as the regional wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, although for the populations concerned they were hardly minor skirmishes, but those sorts of wars, would probably have a different character. And so I think the political mobilization and the need in particular to clamp on opposition at home will be much stronger. The sort of statement of Sir Patrick Sanders is, I think, really, quite extraordinary. We've not heard anything of that character since the end of the Cold War. And the idea that we must prepare for a war with Russia is, I think, really quite open and blatant. And also the assumptions about conflict with China, which are building up. So I see it really in that form, Tina. I think it's different from 1914, but it's actually more serious because, of course, we've got nuclear weapons, and indeed, the ability of states to kill people, as we've seen in the Ukraine, is now much greater. The sophistication of weapons, particularly when targeted at civilian populations, now makes wars quite horrific. And I don't put forward this perspective with any great joy. I don't wish for these sorts of things to happen, but I think politically we must prepare for them, and also prepare for the politics that can flow from that. The rallying round the nation, rallying round the government, let's all pull together against the common enemy. These things will, I think, become stock in trade in politics. And if for example, another Julian Assange reveals the machinations of NATO, then he will be, revealed as a traitor. There will be a tremendous outcry, and the clamping down of any sort of criticism, I think will be very detrimental to our movement, and above all, building that movement up, building a political alternative to imperialism and capitalism.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, let's bring in Deepa now. Thank you for joining us, Deepa. You're from the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and you've been an observer to the case for, well, it's been going on for years, hasn't it? Julian has been in the Belmarsh high security, maximum security prison since 2019 without any legal grounds. I mean, how does the government get away with that kind of situation?
Shall I start, Tina, by giving a little bit of background on the legal context of the case and then answering your question as a kind of response to that? Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here to speak in defense of Julian. And I say this because I'm an independent legal observer in the case, and essentially looking at whether due process rights have been respected. But I also, I think, when you see a grave injustice being done, it is difficult to say, I'm independent, I'm not going to say anything about this. So it is from that position that I'm making these observations. So I don't speak formally on behalf of the Haldane today, although that's on whose behalf I have conducted this legal observation. For those of you who haven't been following the case closely, I can tell you a little bit about WikiLeaks, etc., if you're interested, but just in terms of the legal context of the case, Julian Assange is being pursued under the 1917 Espionage Act of the US. So it is very important in terms of the three main things you have to remember that this is an extraterritorial application of a US act, which is deeply contested even in the US. So people find that there are aspects of this act which are deeply troubling. So for that not just to be applied in the US, but then for that to overreach into the rest of the world, where we have a non-US journalist who is revealing information about US war crimes and has done that outside the US and is being plucked up and extradited to the US in this fig leaf of a legal process, is something that we all need to be concerned about, because essentially this extradition criminalizes all kinds of journalism which reveals the crimes of powerful states. And America is setting the precedent that tomorrow, if Russia is a more powerful state or China is a more powerful state, as long as they have an extradition arrangement with another country, they can pretty much request a journalist. This is the precedent that is being set. The other precedent that is being set is one that is, you will have heard a lot about in the media, which is, this is it is setting a chilling precedent for the free press and for public interest journalism, etc. But what I want to say is that chilling precedent doesn't have to be set by Julian's extradition. That chilling precedent has already been set by the 7 years during which he was almost 7 years that he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, essentially denied medical care, denied basic rights, and the time that he's now going to spend his 4th birthday in prison. He turns 51 on the 3rd of July. So that chilling precedent has been set, which means that if tomorrow somebody were to give an important journalist a copy of what happened, the equivalent of the Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs, which is one of the things that Julian published, then they could also be very, very nervous to even disclose those documents in a small circle. So both the receipt and the transmission of that evidence is now being criminalized. So it's not just Julian published it, that's a problem. It's also receiving that information that has become a problem now. What are the next steps? So there are 3 layers of appeal. Firstly, there is an appeal against Priti Patel's decision at the High Court, and that appeal will be put in before the 1st of July, I believe. That's the 14-day timeline since the, I can't remember the exact date, but around the 1st of July. The second set of appeals relates to, as many of you will know, Julian won the case against extradition at the Magistrates' Court, but he won it in relation to his health and the fact that the US prison conditions would be considered to be oppressive in the context of his health and, what he might suffer there. So the way the Extradition Act works, which, in most court cases, you have to prove something beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities. But in extradition law, the presumption, especially when you have a treaty with another country, is in favor of extradition. And so you have to hit certain bars to be outside that extradition. And one of the bars that was triggered was this one related to health. But of course, the broader questions about free speech, public interest journalism, etc., were ones that Julian lost at the lower court. And those can now be appealed in what is termed as a cross appeal. So Julian's lawyers have already put in some months ago grounds for that, and that's another layer of appeal that has to be done. The third layer of appeal is something quite technical, which is in relation to the fact that, as you probably know, when he went to the High Court and the US overturned the decision at the Court of Appeal, Julian's lawyers then had the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court, where they had to raise a point of law. And the Supreme Court, quite disappointingly, given the type of issue that was, and I'm happy to go into detail if people want to hear it, but I don't want to bore everybody with the detail, chose not to hear it. And so the domestic remedies in Britain in relation to the US assurances, which is that the US loses this case, and then once it's lost its case, it says, oh, I'll give you all these assurances, which I didn't bother telling you in court, which cannot be tested at all. And that's the remedies against the US doing that have already been exhausted in the UK. So Julian's lawyers can go to the European Court of Human Rights on that ground. The other important thing to think about in terms of the legal context and the Espionage Act is that it has no public interest defense. So when Julian is extradited to the US to face 175 years in prison, he will not be able to defend himself on the grounds that what he did was in the interests of those who were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the interests of those people who were innocent civilians held in Guantanamo Bay as a result of their sale in exchange for bounties. So this kind of defense will not be able to be provided. Neither will he have protections under what most people recognize in terms of free speech protections in the US in relation to the First Amendment. So the United States prosecutors have mentioned at the trial, at the extradition hearings, that he will not be afforded First Amendment protections. So this means that essentially, were Julian to be extradited, he would die in prison in America, because the way the American system works, plea bargains are the way they go. They make you serve time. Either you serve time in America, or in Julian's case, they've said they will not object to him to Australia making a request to get him to serve time in Australia. But Australia so far hasn't even bothered to give him any consular assistance beyond what they would give a backpacker. So whether Australia would ask for him to serve a sentence in Australia is another story. But also, very importantly, why should he be serving a sentence? As Kevin rightly pointed out, it is the war criminals like Bush and Blair who should be at The Hague, and Julian Assange should be revered and hailed as somebody who has done a great service to humanity. Firstly, in allowing us to do that basic of human things, which is common across very many different cultures, which is to respect those who've died, to give them a name, to give them an identity. And one of the people who died was an 8-year-old child by the name of Hanan Saleh Mathrood, who used to play in the streets, pick up little sweets from the troops who were in Iraq, and she was gunned down in the street. Another example is of something that I would urge all of you to please try and commemorate. On the 12th of July is the anniversary of what is known as collateral murder. If you wish to watch the video, it is quite distressing. It's collateralmurder.wikileaks.org. And you can see a short version as well as a long version of this video, where you see American troops in an Apache helicopter gunning down innocent civilians, including a Good Samaritan who stopped to pick up wounded people, which is, of course, a war crime, and also gunning down 2 Reuters journalists. And it would be nice if within the community, just as a aside to mention here, more people on the 12th of July or thereabouts could organize various screenings of collateral murder and talk about the lives that were lost, not just in that particular incident, but in other incidents across Iraq and Afghanistan, where a lot of innocent people have been killed and raped and tortured, just because they're, people talk about Black Lives Matter. But if you do not recognize the importance of these lives, as Julian Assange did, and give them
Oops. Deepa, I think your internet has stopped. Oh, there it is.
Is when he's in the US, his pre-trial detention conditions, that is, even before, any hearings have taken place as to whether he's guilty, etc., will be determined by the CIA and the FBI, amongst other agencies. The reality of that is that the CIA and the FBI are involved in a serious plot to kidnap, poison, or assassinate Julian while he was in the embassy. And that's really, it's like saying, here are your murderers, your potential murderers, and let's hand you over to them, which is what the British government and Priti Patel have just done. The third thing about this case, which is really unusual and astonishing, is that, sorry, there's a printer going off, is that it is really distressing that the legal community, and I urge judges and lawyers and others within the legal community to come forward and speak up, because to find out that Gareth Peirce and her team have been systematically spied upon, that those spied privileged conversations have been handed over to the US, and there is a denial of attorney-client confidentiality, is something that should worry everybody. We cannot have due process when the defendant cannot have a reasonable conversation with his or her lawyer. And not only has confidential legal information been handed over, when Julian was extracted in that horrible process from the Ecuadorian embassy, he was deprived illegally of citizenship. He's an Ecuadorian citizen. He should not have been allowed to be extracted from that embassy. There was no due process carried out in relation to either the extraction or the withdrawal of citizenship. And the Ecuadorians in that process, with the help of Alan Duncan, who has talked about it so wonderfully in his memoirs in relation to Operation Pelican, the Ecuadorians have actually handed over Julian's privileged legal documentation, which was held in the embassy, to the Americans. Now, this means that the British complicity in this means that a fair trial cannot take place in the UK, and the American involvement in this, in their pursuit of this in such an illegal way, means that a fair trial cannot take place in the US. So this case should have been dropped a long time ago. And it is a stain on our legal community that nobody has spoken up. All these fancy judges with their wonderful wigs and their glorious buildings, none of them have spoken up in relation to these fundamental breaches of due process. And they need to speak up now. They need to grow a backbone now. It is very heartening, though, that organizations ranging from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch to Reporters Without Borders and other press freedom organizations, including the IFJ, have all now spoken up in favor of Julian, essentially saying that the extradition is a grave mistake. Julian has suffered quite a lot, as you can imagine. Most other journalists in a situation where they are treated in this way, where they are smeared, isolated, physically in a very fragile condition. He has osteoporosis, depression, and he's also on the autism spectrum. And so the 10 years without sunlight, both at the embassy and in the prison, have been very, very hard on him. As you can imagine, the psychological torture of going through the Swedish smears, for example, where an effort was made to keep the case throughout in a preliminary investigation stage, so that exculpatory evidence that would, clear him, did not have to be disclosed, meant that he went through a lot of alienation from the very support that he deserves, which is particularly on the left and amongst free speech, those committed to free speech on the right. So it has been a very difficult time for him. His depression has gotten worse. He's in such a fragile state that about 6 months ago, he had a trans-ischemic attack, which is like a mini stroke, which is a precursor to a full stroke, while he was in Belmarsh prison. And what was sad about this, I was in court the day this happened. Julian was not allowed to attend the hearing in person. So he was watching this on a video on the screen. And we were all, we could see the small image of him on the screen. And you could see him slowly slumping. And in the court, James Lewis QC, who should be ashamed of himself for the way he behaved, was telling the judges and the court what a malingerer Julian was. Actually, what was happening was Julian was having a stroke. And this kind of torture the psychological torture that Julian has endured has been something that most other people would find very difficult to endure. And yet Julian has had the courage to stand up to the imperialist powers, in particular America, and not withdraw the documentation, because one thing which is very important to remember about WikiLeaks is that it has a 100% track record of accuracy. So to this day, all the evidence that it has released is not contestable by America. What they are contesting is the fact that a whistleblower, i.e. Chelsea Manning, had the courage to release the information to Julian. The other thing that is very important to remember is that there are 2 or 3 key smears, and it's very important to get your head around these if you're intending to advocate for Julian. One relates to the Swedish case, and that's a very important smear because, you know, like most ordinary normal people, most of us are revolted by sexual assault allegations, just like we would be with pedophilia or any other similar things. And these allegations can be misused extremely grotesquely to create a context where the real crimes are not seen. So the women in Sweden, not only did they not receive justice because the process was kept open for 7 years and there was no way of, you know, potentially bringing it to court in a reasonable way. They were also a human shield for the rapes, war, murder, torture that took place in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the horrendous sodomy and brutality against the prisoners at Guantanamo. So it is very important that we understand this, and a good place to start is, if you like reading and you're engaged with politics, is a recent book by Professor Niels Meltzer, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who is a fluent speaker of Swedish and has reviewed all the documentation. I will put the link to the book in the chat. It's available at half price on Verso's site at the moment, so it might be something that you wish to pick up and share with your friends and pass along. The other important thing to remind people is that in addition to the collateral murder anniversary, there is also on July 3rd, it's Julian's 51st birthday. There will be a vigil outside Belmarsh prison and other events taking place around that date. If you're able to go to one or more of those, that would be very welcome. It's really important, if you can, to maybe put a poster in your window to say you free Julian Assange. But most of you who are left activists know that what matters is where you are on the ground. There are weekly vigils taking place outside Parliament, before the recess or whenever that is, I can't remember. But there are also those kinds of things that are taking place in central London, in Belmarsh, etc., on a weekly basis, that if you feel able to, please do join, and please talk. If you have a trade union group or a community group, please pass a motion or invite somebody like me to come and talk to your group to tell them what's happening. Because a lot of people, I'm amazed at the number of people who come to me and say, oh, is he in America? Is he in Ecuador? Is he in the embassy? And unless you're really paying attention, then the fact that you have a cost of living crisis, that people are struggling with this pandemic of poverty that has been unleashed upon us by the Tories, people are struggling with their lives. And so they don't recognize how important Julian Assange is. And what is important about Julian is not just the torture and the suffering that this one man is having. It's the most important thing is that we only understand what goes on behind closed doors, whether it is climate justice, whether it is crimes in a care home, whether it is crimes in the justice system, whether it is corporate criminality. We only understand those crimes through the courage of whistleblowers who understand what's really going on and dare to tell us the truth. And it is only when we support those who facilitate these whistleblowers' words getting into the public domain and embedding themselves into the public consciousness that we can change society, that any of our causes, anything that we care about, can actually go forward. So it is really important that people recognize that this is not just about Julian. You may not like Julian, you don't have to like him. You know, he's on the autism spectrum. He has various personality traits that somebody may or may not like. Who cares? What matters is that whistleblowing and public interest journalism are important, They are important pillars of democracy. And this government and Keir Starmer should be ashamed of themselves for what they have done to suppress it. Keir Starmer's role is particularly grotesque as the leader of the Labour Party, because when he was DPP, his department wrote to the Swedes saying, don't you dare get cold feet. This is not being treated like any other extradition. And Keir Starmer has the gall to this day to pretend as though he knows more about the case than he's letting on, and he understands what's really going on. Whereas actually what he has done is been complicit in the crimes against Julian Assange through his silence in relation to his persecution. And many of us have many other views about Keir Starmer's shamelessness, but that's another story for another day. But I'll stop there, Tina, and I'm happy to take any questions, either in relation to WikiLeaks and why they were different and important compared to other news media, which I haven't covered, or any other questions that your audience might have. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Deepa. Unsurprisingly, we've got quite a few people with their hands up already who I'm making into panelists now. I presume you can join us for a while, can't you? You can answer some questions, etc. So I'm going to bring in Minnie first. Caroline Keane. Please, if you could switch on your camera.
Hi, sorry, yes,
Hi,
Minnie, as people know me as Minnie, so it's Caroline, but know me as Minnie. Thank you, Deepa. I follow you on Twitter and I've listened to you lots. Thank you so much. Solidarity to Julian, his family and Stella. It is indeed chilling the way he's being treated. He was strip searched. Patel, Priti Patel, left it till the last day until they made the judgment. It's like they want to leave everything as long as possible, just leave, and they're waiting for him to die. They want him to die. He was strip searched and put in a bare cell for his own protection on the day the extradition was announced. Also, when the boys went, his children went to visit, one of the little boys had picked daisies to show his dad, and the little boy's pockets were searched and the daisies taken. I mean, it's sick, completely sick. The establishment is based around smearing people. And we've seen that recently with the latest. I mean, go along to the grey zone and read about the Paul Mason and what's going on there and all the links, and how there's a company, is it called, not PMQ's linked, there's a company called, is it Valent or something, which is linked to the Labour Party and being given contracts. And we've obviously just heard from what you said, and Keir Starmer's allegedly said, don't you dare get cold feet or whatever, or somebody at the department DPP office about Assange to Sweden, was it? And Jen Robinson, one of his lawyers, she's been spied on. The British government has recently admitted, haven't they, to spying on another one of the lawyers. Under the radar, of course, not much of this gets in the media. Hardly any of it gets in the media, which is all on side. But I took part in a documentary called Anatomy of a Witch Hunt, because I was in the Labour Party, and I actually did use the Labour Left Alliance motion, I think it was November 2020, about freeing Assange, campaigning, etc., etc., protection of Julian Assange, how he's an innocent man, the extrajudicial reach, etc., etc. Now, I put that motion to the Labour Party, and as we know, we have opportunists there who will get on side with anyone, fake left, basically. And what they did was they took that motion down by saying, oh, well, we don't want Julian Assange extradited to America. Let's get him extradited to Sweden. I was closed down by the chair. Well, it was after the wave before Deepa were taken, and we had a coup, and sort of more right-wing people were put in, and the chair wouldn't let me come back on that to say, well, hang on a minute, he's not wanted in Sweden. He was never charged with anything. And even being interviewed, that was all dropped ages ago. I wasn't allowed to say that. My only option at the Labour Party was to pull the motion, because the right wing voted for that amendment. So the motion fell. This how people are being, that they don't care, and the extrajudicial reach that is extra scary. Yeah, and I wanted to say there's a new Bill of Rights going through at the moment. I'm just trying to get my head around it this afternoon, reading it. Deepa, I wonder if you could say anything about that, because it's something to do with, it's not going to replace the EHCR, which will still be there, but it's going to interpret it, and there's going to be some clause put in to say about interpret it in the British way. And I'm wondering whether part of that is, obviously that would be Assange's last stand, is my understanding legally, is the European Court of Human Rights. Deepa, so I'd be grateful if you could say something about that. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minnie. I'm going to take a couple of other speakers, if that's okay. We've also had a question in the chat, which I'm going to read out. Deepa, I hope you can take some notes. What options does Julian have now? And you did just speak on that a little bit. But is Joe Biden, likely to be lenient with him? That's an interesting question. He's a Democrat, isn't he? Of sorts, huh? Okay, Neil is joining us from, I don't know where you are at the moment. Are you still in New Zealand?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, I'm actually joining you from Australia.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. So please be kind to me. But I just thought I'd give you an Aussie perspective on this. A lot of people heard express. Well, let me say first of all, like everybody else, I'm absolutely appalled by the treatment of Julian Assange and the outrageous activities of the British government, and most recently Priti Patel. I mean, it's absolutely shameful. But a lot of people, having noted the change of government down here in Australia with the exit of the Morrison government, and a lot of people, everyone was very pleased to see the end of him. With the new government under Anthony Albanese, there's been some hope that for socialism in general, and also for Julian Assange. I mean, let me first of all say on those people expressed their hopes for socialism with regards to Albanese. Well, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, despite the fact that Albanese comes from the so-called left faction in the Australian Labour Party. He is no Jeremy Corbyn. And the foreign policy is absolutely indistinguishable from the Morrison government, for example, pro-NATO, pro-AUKUS, pro the Zelensky regime. That Australia is supplying arms to Ukraine. On Israel, absolutely is the Australian Labour Party is absolutely paralysed by the grip that the Israel lobby has on it. And for example, they're pro-IHRA, they're still imposing the IHRA indefinition on public institutions here, including my own university, the University of New South Wales. On domestic policy, on housing, energy, they're indistinguishable from the Tories. It's effectively really just another kind of Tory government. But nevertheless, I want to say, despite that, there is still some hope. The case of Julian Assange down here is actually very prominent in the newspapers. For example, the Sydney Morning Herald, which is the Aussie equivalent of the Guardian. I mean, like the Guardian, it's sort of pro-imperialist vehicle for war propaganda and so on. But nevertheless, on the case that they have been quite good about Julian Assange. Within the Parliament, there is a cross-parliamentary group of MPs who are making a lot of fuss, actually. And within the Australian Labour Party, there are some figures, including Bob Carr, who is a former Foreign Affairs Minister and former Premier of New South Wales. He is making quite a big case. I've got a newspaper article here. I don't see that this was written recently by Bob Carr, published in the Sydney Morning Herald, putting pressure on Anthony Albanese to, through the diplomatic channels, persuade Biden to give a pardon to Julian. points out that Barack Obama pardoned Chelsea Manning, who was the person who actually gave the information to Julian. So if the person who actually leaked the information that WikiLeaks and other journals, including The Guardian, published, why is it that Julian is still being incarcerated and treated this way? The Albanese is not, he is on record as saying that this has gone on too long and that you know, the case should come to an end. He hasn't said publicly that he is going to do anything, but his hints are that behind the scenes he is using what channels there are available for Australia, which after all is the US deputy sheriff, if you like, in the Pacific, to do, you know, basically pardon Julian. So I think there is some hope, and I think so in terms of action, I would say that in addition to everything else that's going on, keep the pressure up on the Australian embassy in London. You know, in addition to all the demos, if you can do it, a demo outside the Australian embassy would be maybe a way of reminding the Australian High Commission that there is this case going on of an Australian citizen. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. It wasn't really a question, it was just some points from down, the view from down under. But by the way, I'm actually now a permanent resident in Australia, and I'm now free to travel. I'm no longer a COVID exile, so I will be traveling to London quite soon. So hopefully catch up with you in person, so maybe at a demo. Okay, cheers. Thanks for giving me a.
Thanks very much, Neil. Very interesting points, I think. Especially, you know, Chelsea Manning, etc., and exercising pressure on the Australian embassy. Good ideas. Deepa, do you want to come back on some of the things you've heard so far?
I do. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things which Minnie said at the start. You're right, Minnie. Just last week, we had an announcement that Julian's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, has received a settlement at the European Court of Human Rights in relation to her deprivation of her human rights as a result of British spying on her privileged legal conversations, which of course she was WikiLeaks' lawyer. So it is quite obvious that Britain also spied on Assange, and we have evidence of that on YouTube. So you don't have to go far to find the evidence, because it's the conversations are actually available to view. The question that was asked was in relation to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is that although the European Court of Human Rights intervened in relation to a particular clause in relation to Rwanda, the European Court of Human Rights is not necessarily a place where you always win. There are people who have been extradited to the US under the say-so of the European Court of Human Rights. And it is very important to recognize that this needs to be stopped now, because Julian is dying. And the longer he stays in prison, we don't know what the physical effects of long-term torture are. And we have already seen one episode of a stroke. Things can get a lot worse, and he's alone in the prison. He doesn't have sufficient medical care for somebody with his complex medical needs. So the longer the process takes, the process is punishment. And Minnie is right in saying that they just want him to die. They want him to either suicide or die. And that's something that we need to recognize. Neil, one other thing I wanted to highlight in relation to all those things that you just nailed it, is that Michael Pompeo, the former head of the CIA, who is responsible for labeling WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence agency, has now been summoned by Spanish courts to Spain in the case of Assange that is taking place in Spain, to explain why the US tried to murder Assange. So not that Pompeo is going to appear, but the judge has now found sufficient cause to be able to ask for Michael Pompeo to make himself present, as he has done for British prosecutors. So this is a very important case going on in Spain in relation to the spying on Julian. And lastly, the comments about Joe Biden and will he be lenient, which was a question which came online. Biden is part of the same warmongering, neoliberal kind of grouping that is causing war and destruction all over the world. I mean, of course, he has his problems with dementia, etc. as well, but they are part of the same coalition who appoint the same people. It's just a slight change of faces. So I think yes, more pressure can be put on the Democrats than it was on Trump's Republican Party, but it's going to be very difficult. And I think the more effort is made in America, the better. And lastly, about Albanese, I think the person to really thank in Australia is Andrew Wilkie and the fantastic work that he has done in that cross-party parliamentary group. I was amazed to see that I believe it is 90 Greek parliamentarians have come together. There are lots of different parliamentary groups all over Europe. So if you have connections to other countries, please help set up parliamentary groups there who can put pressure on the Australians, on Biden and others to do the right thing. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Deepa. That's very clear, and thank you for outlining the appeals process as well. Tony Greenstein has a question. Larry, you've got your hand up, but you've not got your camera switched on. Could you do so, then I can take you next?
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone see me? Sorry, my camera's a bit... yeah, I mean, I'd like to pay tribute to the work, indefatigable work of Deepa, and also to thank her personally for sending me this book, which actually opened my eyes. It's by Niels Meltzer, who's the UN rapporteur for torture, and I do highly recommend it, The Case of Assange, because I think you will understand. He goes into particular detail about the rape allegations, because I think they were almost deliberately chosen in order to find a soft spot for the left. And it's not surprising. Sorry, I'll just turn my phone off. It's not surprising that this was done, because, I mean, anyone with any eye to history will know that in the United States, the Deep South, one of the favourite charges against black people, the Scottsboro 12, etc., was the allegation of rape, because this then causes people to almost suspend judgment. You know, if someone's accused of rape, they are guilty. But if you actually look into the case, then the allegations of rape were actually not made by the women themselves. It was made by the Swedish state, or on a very technical legal basis. And initially the prosecutor threw it out. And it was only the federal or the state prosecutor who overrode, I think it was a Stockholm prosecutor who had dismissed the charges. I think that's right. So, but this has had a quite damaging effect. I mean, I've had a blazing row with my local MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle, who refuses to support Assange. He's allegedly in the campaign group, though quite what he's doing there, well, maybe it's a good place for him, but I know for a fact that it was the rape allegations which gave him the excuse not to defy Starmer, etc. I also agree, and just one thing before I go to the next point. I was quite interested to read in the book, because I thought, listening to the case and keeping an eye on it, that I found it almost incomprehensible that Assange's legal team, when they were denied effective access to their own clients, simply didn't walk out of court and say that Baraitser was irredeemably biased and then go to the higher court. There is a precedent for that. It was Peter Payne, who became a High Court judge, who walked out of the National Industrial Relations Court over Sir John Donaldson. And again, it went to the Court of Appeal. In fact, Donaldson was overruled because of his outrageous behaviour. I have no doubt that if they'd done that, then it would have thrown into sharp relief the whole nature of the process at the Magistrates' Court, because it was clear that the Westminster Magistrates' Court, Baraitser and the one before her, Lady Arbuthnot, I think it was, were biased, so biased in terms of their connections to the military-industrial complex. There was no way they could possibly have a neutral opinion on this, but unfortunately that was not taken. They sought to confine their arguments within a court where the magistrate, I think, ruled every single time in favour of the prosecution, whatever the point they made. I think the second thing is the sticking on the legalities, that we've seen a change in the complexion and the political orientation of the Supreme Court and the Appeal Court itself in Britain. We had quite a liberal period, if you remember, under Lady Hale, but that's gone now. The Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal have made it pretty clear to the government they're not going to stand in the way of any major programmatic planks when it comes to civil liberties, immigration, etc. We saw that with the Rwandan flight. I mean, it was absolutely outrageous that they decided you could deport someone without first finding whether it was even lawful to deport them, on the grounds you could bring them back eventually. But that is the nature of the British judicial process, of course. It is politically, it has very acute political antenna. I agree also with Kevin when he says we are in a different political epoch. And I think we have to understand that. The United States is striving for unipolar domination of the world. And anyone who doesn't understand that really needs to think very hard. What's happening in Ukraine, because Ukraine, if you like, is the focus for it. It's a pretext for it. It's a war that has been created by the United States. In fact, really, the war has been going on since 2014. There's been fighting over the Donbass ever since, and Russia has been provoked sufficiently, and the United States has been doing its best to provoke it into invading. I think that was a mistake, but that's by the by. The idea that we can simply classify it as an anti-imperialist war is really to absolve ourselves of taking a clear position. The major dominant imperialist power in the world today is the United States, with the European Union following in its footsteps. And we have to understand that. And it's not, of course, just Russia. I mean, China is in its sights with the AUKUS Pact and so on, again, under the banner of human rights. Their concern for the Uyghur Muslims contrasts with their concern for the Muslims in India, for example. So we see human rights as a major weapon in the hands of the imperialists. What else really could I say? I mean, the question of the rape is really, I think, like anti-Semitism. It's one of these identity politics issues which causes complete confusion in the left, and they're unable to think clearly. And it's had a very damaging effect. But I think it's clear that the left itself needs to make Assange a much more high priority issue, because it is extremely important in terms of, if you like, the rush to war and the fact that they don't want their secrets leaked as to what they're really up to. I mean, that is their fear. The United States, of course, isn't at all concerned about human rights in China or Russia or anywhere else. It's concerned about achieving world dominance. And it doesn't matter at whose expense that comes. And of course, it's afraid, therefore, that if the secrets of actually what it is doing leak out, then people will begin to question that. So, I mean, we have to politicize things, because it's not like 1914, where there was a rough parity of arms, if you like, in the European continent between the Germans and the Austrians and was it the Turks and whoever in Russia, France and Britain. That was an imperialist war. What's happening in Ukraine today isn't, but that is part and parcel, if you like, of the whole kaleidoscope that we see at the moment. So I hope we get it right. Just one thing on Australia, it is obviously helpful, to say the least, that a social democratic party has attained power, but we know how social democracy bends to the winds of imperialism very easily and goes along with it, and no better representative than Starmer. But I just wanted to pick up Neil's one point of Neil when he said Australia is in the grip of the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby does not control the foreign policy. It may be the very useful pretext that you can point to Jews and say that's who we are defending. But Australia determines its own foreign policy. It may get help from the Israel lobby in terms of quashing dissent at home, but never let us mistake the tail for the head of the dog. Thank you.
Nicely put, Tony. Thank you. I suggest we're going to take the two more speakers who've got their hands up. and then get Deepa to sum up, because we are trying to finish by 7:30. I'm sure we're going to overrun a little bit, but not too much, hopefully. I'm trying to hold off my cat here. Okay, Larry, please, would you come in? You need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Yeah, got it. Thank you very much.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Thank you, Deepa. What I'm going to do is try and put a little slightly different perspective on the contribution from Deepa, and I'll be interested to hear a point of view on it. And she raised the issue of complicity within the movement. And one of the things that I was concerned with, and why I attended this meeting tonight, was that the TUC demonstration on the 18th of June had no mention of the unjust and imprisonment of Julian Assange. And this was the biggest demonstration in London for many years. And the reason for raising that is because, given the government's intention of openly making the attacks on trade union rights to strike, particularly the present RMT dispute, and the government's undemocratic stand on both workers' rights and politicising these attacks, we have to make the link between these campaigns, the trade union rights and the Julian Assange rights. The campaign to support Julian Assange and his extradition and his release, because it's not just about the extradition, it's about his release as well. He has done no wrong, he has committed no crime, and he is no criminal. The only way for his release is to link these campaigns to trade union strikes, drawing parallels of the political to the political level that Tony indicated in his last contribution. When I was a News International striker way back in '86 and '87, I was invited to the London School of Economics students sit-in that they had a dispute down there. I didn't just talk about our strike, I spoke about the Winston Silcott case, because we needed to broaden the horizons of the political temperament at that particular time. And that needs to happen today in relation to Julian Assange and industrial action that's on the agenda. Therefore, what I would like to do is call the London Labour Left Alliance to call upon the RMT General Secretary, Mick Lynch, to demand his release. Now, if he'd made a contribution like that at the demonstration on the 18th, it would have raised the political level of the Julian Assange case in a different direction. And we've also got at the moment the threatened legislation to legally entitle to enrol agency workers as strike breakers. This must be taken up in the movement, must be seen as political and opposed to as such. We need to mount a campaign against these proposals of agency workers to be supplemented in cases like the RMT dispute. Thank you very much, Tina.
Thanks, Larry. We need a working class party, don't we? Would be nice if we had a Labour Party that could be relied upon to do anything useful. Steve is our last speaker from the floor, and then we go back to Deepa. Hi, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Deepa. First thing is I just want to support what Larry said, because Larry is absolutely spot on, and I'm sure you'll agree with that. There is always a danger, and this is not a criticism, by the way, that if you're struggling, as you have been doing fantastically, a relatively small number of people, as far as I can see, who've been battling away to defend Julian in a heroic fashion, to get sort of a bit separated maybe from the movement, I don't know. And now that we're getting an uplift in strike action and things of that type, is to sort of think, well, you know, that's where the action is in a way. The campaign has got to go in that direction, as opposed to, you know, you've been maybe, you'll tell me if I've got this right, ploughing a relatively lonely field, it seems to me, because he has been isolated by all the things that people said, like the Swedish business and all that. So that's isolated him from a wider liberal opinion, if you want to say, and left him quite isolated with a heroic number of comrades like yourself who've been fighting and fighting to defend him in every way. But if the movement's having a little of an uplift, and it undoubtedly is, then we've got to get back in that direction. We've got to do exactly what Larry just said to us. We've got to find a way to do that. So that's my first point. And one of the I just want to make this point because I did raise this question with some comrades in Scotland, you remember, a long time ago, and they started going on about Sweden, and we're having a fight about Sweden. But I want to say this as a trade union representative, when I was a trade union representative, whenever I defended any person in front of management, the management and other fellow workers would start saying they're a terrible person, we didn't like them, they did this, they did that. They started going on about the personality of the person, whether you like them. And I would say, I don't give a toss about their, more or less, I don't give a toss about what they did or didn't do or how nice they are. It's irrelevant. The issue is the issue. And we have to know what the issue is, and we're fighting for the issue. The issue is free speech and defending rights of journalists to expose what the hell's going on. And that's what we're fighting for. It doesn't matter whether we like Julian Assange or we don't. It's irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. And we have to keep the issue. I realize you can't do that because this is the thing that's being thrown at Sweden's was, you don't hear it much now, but was being thrown at him. And it was in a damaging way, just the same way as they did, as people said, against Jeremy Corbyn, various stuff that they did against him. So just to go on from, and just building on what Larry said, because it's not just the case, I think, that we are suffering an economic cost of living crisis with these strikes going on, but we're facing a political and constitutional crisis in this country about the powers of government. And I think that is an issue that's lurking underneath all this. It's about the powers of the Crown, about the powers of the Home Secretary, about the courts, the justice system, the Constitution, the Human Rights Act. So while, adding to what Larry said, is the idea we must open up the fact that our democracy is absolutely failing at this moment in time, and it's unclear what that's doing, and which is why I think what Kevin said at the beginning, looking at the bigger picture in which we locate this battle, which is not just industrial, but it's also political, and we have to find our way into that. And because the Johnson government is actually quite weak, but also very dangerous, because its very weakness makes it very dangerous. It's dependent on keeping in with Biden over a whole series of other things. And so therefore is more likely to hand over Julian Assange for that reason, because that's what if that's what the Americans want. And my final point would be this, is I was thinking, supposing that they did, I don't know how long this legal process will take before it comes to an end, and if it's not one at that point, then he's put on a plane and carried off to America. But what do we do then if he's gone to America? How would we therefore even have the ambition of reversing the whole thing? What would have to happen in this country to say we want him to come back here? What sort of situation would we have to be in to say we want him back? We don't want him to go in the first place, but also we have to kind of think ahead sometimes to think of what would that require us to do. So anyway, that's just some thoughts, but just end on this point. Larry's spot on, and the industrial disputes that are going on, is to link in with those is really, really important in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, Deepa, now, if you could reply to some questions or raise any other issues that haven't been covered yet. Thank you very much.
Sure, comrade, thank you. Firstly, I just wanted to go back to Tony's contribution, which is actually very helpful in a lot of ways, but also there are some things where I think Tony and I differ in terms of how we think about things. Firstly, you're absolutely right, Tony, in pointing out that Sweden, Ecuador, Australia, Britain, and America, 5 states have ganged up on Assange. Sweden, for example, is doing it because it had firstly, Sweden, with its new NATO ambitions and other things, has always been a lackey of America. People think of Sweden in terms of Palme's Sweden, but actually Sweden has changed, and we have to recognize that. but also Sweden we know from WikiLeaks cables that Sweden wanted to prolong the war in Afghanistan because it wanted to sell Gripen fighter jets. And one of the things about Sweden worth remembering in relation to the Swedish allegations is that Julian and his lawyers requested time and again to be interviewed by the Swedish prosecutors. Julian even offered to go to Sweden to be interviewed as long as he got a commitment that he would not be onward rendited to the US. And he did this at a time when there was a case of two Egyptian men, Elzari and Agiza, who were two refugees in Sweden, who were going through, whom Egypt was trying to get back. And Sweden overnight sent them to Egypt with the complicity of the Americans who arranged the transport. And these men were subsequently tortured in Egypt. So despite knowing that, Julian offered to go to Sweden to be interviewed, and that shows his willingness to be interviewed. The other point you made, Tony, which I wanted to pick up on, was in relation to not Gareth as a solicitor, but Edward Fitzgerald and Mark Summers were the barristers in court walking out in relation to Vanessa Berica being hugely biased, in terms of allowing things like a second superseding indictment to be served partway through the case, not saying anything about Julian's privileged papers being taken, etc., etc. But, I think Gareth made the right decision, given that she won the case at Magistrates Court. And I know for you and me, it seems like a risky decision, but Gareth, given her phenomenal experience and understanding of how the law works, I think probably made the right choice. I am not one to second guess her or Edward Fitzgerald and Mark, who've been very, very good in terms of when I've seen them in court, they've been absolutely excellent. The other point you made was about Guantanamo, and or maybe somebody made it in the chat, which is that whether America cares about Muslim men and their rights. And, to this day, 20 years after Guantanamo was opened, 40 odd men are still at Guantanamo. 20 of them have been cleared for release, but have not been released. 789 Muslim men were tortured at Guantanamo. Only a handful of them have had charges brought against them. There are very sad cases like 14-year-old Omar Khader, who was, brought to Guantanamo as a child. There's the gentleman from Brighton who lost his eyesight because somebody scooped an eye out. The horrific torture that innocent people have endured is something that we really need to feel deeply ashamed of, because we were complicit in all these black sites and in things like Guantanamo, because we were behind the scenes. British Secret Services have been involved in various things that led to people being taken to be tortured. So that's something. Coming back to the other comments from the comrade about getting involved with the unions and industrial action and things like that, and the TUC demo, I think you're right. It would have been nice if Mick Lynch or indeed anybody else, the NUJ General Secretary, had spoken out at the TUC demo. But I think the trade union movement has changed. A lot of unions, including the NUJ, have now spoken up for Assange, which is a huge progress. And I all credit to John Rees, Joseph Farrell, all those who are working to get that done. There is a fear within the trade union movement, partly driven by a complete and utter lack of knowledge about the case, but also an absolute kind of commitment to oppose gender-based violence that has made them close their ears and assume that all accusation is criminality. And that's something that we need to deal with. And, it's hard to deal with it because they're coming from the right perspective, that this is unacceptable. I think there is a deep fear, especially in senior positions, of being tainted by association. So people who know better choose not to say anything because they're worried that they will be called rape apologists, or, for example, if they're SWP members, being called something else. These kinds of things mean that good socialists haven't really spoken up. And the coupling of industrial struggles with social struggles is something that we've heard even people who are heading up the trade union movement saying, oh, I don't look at politics. I just look at what's right in an industrial context, and that's all I'm thinking about. But the fact that politics encompasses all of this is something that we as an informed left need to talk about. But what you can do, I mean, let's not talk about all these people in their big positions and in their great roles. Let's talk about what we can do and what we can do in our branches, what we can do in our little communities. If you can organize a screening of collateral murder and get people to talk about the Iraq war, even if they don't want to talk about Assange, get them to talk about that. If you can arrange a screening about Guantanamo and get people to talk about that, bring Mozambique or somebody from Cage to talk about what they went through, people like Mohamedou Ould Slahi. The film about him, The Mauritanian, was a big box office success. Get him to speak, get these voices heard, and people will soon join the dots. And somebody said, oh, you've been, oh yeah, it was you, Steve, you were talking about, we've been heroically working. Actually, you know, like Niels Meltzer, my situation was very similar in that I didn't realize how bad Julian's condition was in the embassy. It's only when I realized, when he was being pulled out of the embassy, that I realized how bad things were. You know, I wasn't doing anything which I should have done 5-7 years ago. And if you're in the same boat, if like Niels Meltzer, you are put off by these accusations and, you know, have closed your ears to things, then, you know, open your ears now and get talking to other people who are in the same boat as you. And in terms of what this case is about, firstly, it's about the prohibition against torture, which is a non-derogable right. It is not something that can be changed. Julian is being tortured. The UN has certified this twice. And Julian needs, as a torture victim, to be removed from the prison, because you cannot deal with torture while continuing to torture someone. Secondly, this is all about general human rights, because it's about the human rights and the lives of the people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo, in other parts of the world who are being affected, people who are affected by toxic waste dumping in the Ivory Coast, people who are affected by corruption in Kenya, all of the things that WikiLeaks revealed. It is also about our powers to hold to account those who exercise power in our name. WikiLeaks allowed us, for the first time, instead of the state surveilling us, for us to surveil the state. And that was a great power that we have to retain. And lastly, it's also, of course, about democracy and free speech and the many things we've talked about today. So I'm going to stop there after my little monologue, and happy to answer any further questions. I'm here for as long as we need.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Deepa. I think this was a really good session. I think we'll have to leave it at this because it's almost now 7:30, but I think we've covered a lot of ground and we've touched on, you know, what we can do. You've mentioned already some of the practical things comrades can do, passing motions, etc., coming to the weekly rallies outside Parliament, etc. These are all important things. I also think that in the context of what we've been discussing with the industrial struggles picking up in the course of the next months, hopefully, the changing period of imperialism, etc. These are all things that are, I think, should give us hope, actually, that things are changing and we're in a very strange period of flux. We have been defeated with Corbyn's defeat. I think that was a huge setback for the left in Britain in particular, and we're still feeling the effects, but I think something is actually happening, and we are you can sense something with the RMT strike, I think. So there's a bit of hope, and, you know, a campaign like for the freedom of Assange does need a mass campaign, doesn't it? It does need a mass working class party to put real pressure on a mass action. And I don't mean merging your little groups. I don't think that's the way to build a mass working class party. You actually need the working class to be on the move and you know, to fight for its own rights and understand its power as a class. And I think we're getting closer to a period where that might really be the case. So I think we should end this meeting on an up, despite the terrible situation that Assange is in, and we hopefully talk to you again when there are updates, etc. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming along. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us tonight. And we're putting out this video. I'll edit it up a bit, and then we can share it far and wide, because it's been extremely useful, I think, to update us all on what's happening. Thank you very much, Deepa, and have a good evening, comrades. Bye.
Thanks, Tina.